Hi everyone, and welcome to this new session of the lab, the Laboratoire of Gaîté Lyrique. So once again, I'm happy to welcome Antonio Casilli, sociologist, professor at Telecom Paris, and researcher at the CNRS Interdisciplinary Institute of Innovation for the seminar studying digital cultures, which he has been leading for quite many years now at EHESS. So for those of you who may not know Antonio yet, he is, among many other things, the author of several inquiries into digital labor, the condition of platform gig workers and click workers. So this is the third session of the Ethics and Artificial Intelligence series of conversations, which spans from January to June this year. If you haven't been with us before, you can find the videos of the previous sessions on the Gaîté Lyrique website. Tonight, I have the pleasure to leave you with Antonio, the philosopher Shannon Vallor, and the artist and educator Sam Lavigne. Antonio, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Aude. I managed to start talking before unmuting my own mic. I'm very happy to be here for this new session of studying digital cultures. This seminar has been going on for a number of years at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and now is hosted by the Gaîté Lyrique. Tonight we have the immense pleasure of welcoming philosopher Shannon Vallor and artist and educator Sam Lavigne. We will have the first part with Shannon Vallor, and then we will have an artistic counterpoint by Sam Lavigne. First of all, allow me to introduce Shannon Vallor's work. She is a philosopher and a professor. She is the chair, the Bailey Gifford Chair at in the Ethics of Data and AI at the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which is an institute of the University of Edinburgh. She is one of the most brilliant philosophers who has been exploring in the recent years, in the last decade actually, the ethics of technologies. Among her awards in 2015, she received the World Technology Award in Ethics, and she has published a number of articles and a book published in 2016 by Oxford University Press, Technology and the Virtues, a Philosophical Guide to a Future Worth Wanting. And more recently, she has been editing the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy and Technology. I really suggest that you have a look at the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy and Technology that she edited. There are a number of interesting contributions. And by the way, the chapters are already online in the open version on the Oxford Handbooks platform. Well, tonight we will continue with Shannon Vallor's, our exploration in, well, our approach of the ethics of AI. As you know, this is the vertical for this year, the vertical of this, the main theme of this seminar. If you want, we have decided to have conversations with philosophers, sociologists, anthropologists that have explored the topics of the ethics of AI in a way which is less conventional if you consider the mainstream run-of-the-mill ethics of AI that you are probably familiar with. So you will see that Shannon Vallor's approach is extremely innovative in that she basically talks about or explores the topic of the moral debt that technology has created, or mainly that technologists have incurred. And we will see how this has shaped our way the way we use technologies, especially in these pandemic times. So, Shannon, again, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you here. The floor is yours, and we will stay with you and listen to you and watching your slides too for the next 15 minutes. And so see you at on the other side, let's say.
Thank you very much, Antonio. And I'll go ahead and share my slides now. And as I just thank you for inviting me here. I'm really excited to speak well and to share in the remainder of the presentations and conversation. So I'm going to be speaking today about technologies dette. I'm going to explain what that means. As I'm going to speak to a broad audience. So I'm a philosopher, but this talk is not really a sort of technical philosophical talk, but really a provocation of a broader sort. So I want to begin by adding the following premise, and that is that I mean sort of contemporary societies and nations have accumulated heavy burden of moral debt, design, development, deployment, and use of AI and other new technologies. And I'm going to argue that debt must be paid down if AI technology are to help us develop and deliver the more humane futures that are embedded in the concept of technological progress. One of the problems that we're confronting today is that the notion of progress has been out in the way we use it interchangeably with terms like innovation. But innovation is not necessarily progress. Innovation technically just refers to a new way of doing things. It doesn't imply necessarily that it's a better way of doing things. Progress, however, is a normative concept, a value judgment. It suggests that we have achieved some better way of developing our societies, of developing ourselves and our capabilities. And so when we speak about technological progress today, often we just mean that new technologies are available to us. But what we're not paying close enough attention to is which those technologies are actually enabling progress in the sense of futures that are more compatible with human flourishing, more sustainable, not just for ourselves, but future generations of human and other forms of life on this planet. So what I'm looking at today is moral debt that stands in the way of attaining that kind of technological progress. But the optimistic tone of my talk is that there are ways to pay down that moral debt if we have will to do so. So the need to is urgent. We are facing as a human family unprecedented challenges to sustaining the kinds of societies worth wanting. So the status quo is not sustainable. The status quo, keeping everything on the trajectory it is now, ends badly for the human family and for many species of life on this planet. So it's unavoidable that we need to make some fundamental changes to the way that we structure our society institutions and the sorts of values that drive them. The challenges to our sustainable futures are many. We certainly are all aware of the mounting environmental damage that is now not only a local regional problem, but manifest on a planetary scale, accompanied by waves of biodiversity collapse that are making our ecosystems increasingly more fragile. And on top of that, and related to it, we have global challenges of health, including the pandemic. And thanks to technology, these public health threats, specifically devastating viruses, can travel at 900 kilometers per hour. So the dangers are literally moving faster than they were and spreading wider than they were a century ago. Similarly,
I'm sorry, Shannon, sorry to interrupt you, but you seem to have a bit of a sound problem. Would you mind changing back to your computer mic? I'm very, very sorry for this.
No problem at all. I will do that. Echo, or is it cutting out?
It's kind of, let's say, broken. Sometimes you have some robotic sounds.
Sure. Is this working any better?
I hear it fine.
Okay. Let's hope that.
Oh, that's splendid. That's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Would it be helpful for me to go back any further and repeat any of the prior?
I do not think this is necessary. You were going fine. It's just that the sound is definitely better now.
Great, glad to hear it. Okay, sorry for that inconvenience for those of you listening. So the challenges then include not only the travel of physical threats to our well-being, but also the technologically enabled travel and spread of informational harms, information pollution, conspiracy theories, misinformation, disinformation, that travel at nearly light speed and are disseminated in ways that are really driven by human impulses that current technological platforms manipulate and amplify. And as a result, again, of that, so it's important to see that many of these challenges are interlinked. We're seeing a growing problem of public trust in institutions, particularly democratic institutions, and collapsing public trust in expertise. And that becomes an immense challenge, for example, when you need to rely on, for example, the public health expertise of people trained to manage a pandemic, when your publics no longer listen to those voices or no longer accept the authority of their expertise, it becomes even harder to manage the challenges in front of you. So we have some fundamental problems that we need to get better at addressing. So I'm arguing that these global, profoundly complex and fast-moving challenges to 21st century human flourishing cannot be met unless we get better at observing and understanding our environment, our built systems, our own actions, and how all of these impact one another. Now, fortunately, data science and artificial intelligence can be powerful new tools for this purpose. These are ways to amplify our ability to understand, observe, and analyze these challenges and the interactions between them. However, data science and AI used poorly will obscure more than they reveal. And unfortunately, we already have examples of these kinds of deployments of data science and AI tools that actually obscure reality or distort it rather than reveal it. Data science and AI used irresponsibly will undermine public trust and civic cooperation and degrade our informational and physical environment. And we see, for example, concerns already being raised about the carbon footprint of large language models used by many AI behemoth companies to power new advances in AI. So we have environmental concerns, but we also have social and ethical concerns about the fairness of these tools, about the ability of these tools to be used in ways that are accountable, explainable, contestable. And without the ability to address these challenges, public trust in science and technology will only decline further. And data science and AI used unjustly will deprive people of their rights and opportunities to flourish. So we're currently seeing the harms that technological advances of prior decades have generated in the labor economy, where we're seeing that on balance, global income equality has not been keeping pace, or the equality advances have not been keeping pace with our technological advances. And many fear that the AI-driven automation that's coming over the next few decades will only drive global inequality and injustice further unless we put very prudent and far-seeing controls and policies in place. So what that means to me is that, among other things, ethical development of data and AI technologies and ethical deployment of these technologies is what ensures that data science and AI can do the work for us that we need them to do. And whether the ethical deployment needs to be mandated by regulatory controls, in some cases almost certainly, yes, we are going to need better and more stringent regulations, particularly around high-risk deployments of these tools. But that's not going to be enough. We're also going to need to change the norms and standards of the technology culture itself, so that technology developers, in the same ways that we expect medical professionals to hold themselves to certain ethical standards, we need to start expecting technology professionals to hold themselves to certain ethical standards in their work as well. Okay, so now I'm going to just briefly detour, and these are all sort of setup themes before we get into the concept of moral debt itself. I want to talk about human flourishing, and I want to return to this notion of progress and how well it's correlated with the computing advances that we often hear described under the heading of the fourth industrial revolution. So I want to pose a provocative question here. Have advancements in computing to date remained well correlated with advancements in human flourishing? If, as we're often told, science and technology are the gateways to human flourishing and social progress, then we would expect that computing advances would have remained well correlated with other measures of social progress. But as I'm going to suggest, that very plausibly has not been the case. So here from Our World in Data, which is just a great source all around that I encourage you to pore through. But here from Our World in Data, we have a plot that shows growth in average real gross domestic product per capita from 1870 to 2016. And if you look at, let's say, 1960 as the beginning of the computing revolution, and 1980 is when it really took off, you can certainly see that computing advances seem to be very well correlated with growth in average real GDP, particularly in the West, where computing systems have been broadly deployed. Okay, so far so good, as long as we think GDP is a good measure of social progress. However, many researchers and increasingly many economists as well have had to admit that GDP is not an adequate measure of social progress, that it does not track many of the conditions that we see as essential to human progress, whether those be infant mortality, lifespan, rates of violence in societies, economic opportunity and mobility, as well as things like literacy and access to healthcare. So many researchers have been looking for alternative measures of progress, and in fact, there's something called GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicators. And here is just a plot from some research that came out in 2013, looking at how growth in global GDP has been correlated with growth in these Genuine Progress Indicators, or GPI. And as you can see, they seem to remain well correlated until around 1975. And then since about the 1980s, we see that the correlation breaks. And in fact, that growth in GPI per capita seems to be static or even falling slightly, while GDP continues to skyrocket. This, I think, represents the heart of the problem I'm getting at, that we have a growth in GDP that is not exclusively driven by advances in computing technology, but certainly a significant factor has been computing advances, and yet these are not remaining well correlated with measures of social progress and flourishing. So this is the challenge, and this is where we need to talk about technology's moral debt. I'm going to focus, as I do often in my work, on the correlation between emerging technologies in general and recent advances in data-driven and AI systems. But much of what I'm saying about moral debt is not exclusive to data-driven systems, and certainly not exclusive to AI. But I do think that these are sort of data-driven, and AI developments are sort of the leading indicators of the debt problem I'm going to illustrate. Okay, so what is moral debt? I'm going to talk about it as having sort of three different aspects. The first has nothing to do with technology necessarily at all, and that is simply when a social body, a community, a society, delays or neglects the shared moral labor that is necessary for that social body to sustain itself and repair itself over time. When that shared moral labor is neglected, that social body accrues moral debt. Okay, so think about shared moral labor as the kind of equivalent in a society of the maintenance that you have to do on your house, right? If you don't keep up your house by occasionally repairing things, putting resources into it, spending time and attention caring for it, your house will eventually crumble. So there's a kind of physical labor that needs to go into maintaining a house over many decades. Social bodies require labor as well, many different kinds of labor, but one of the most important kinds of labor is moral labor, the kind of labor that keeps social ties strong and resilient, that keeps social trust in place, that allows for bonds of solidarity and affinity and cooperation to continue to function, that allows a shared sense of justice to endure. These are all the things that shared moral labor in a society does. And there are many kinds of shared moral labor. We can talk about the kinds of labor that exist on the local community level, where you might have community organizations that look out for people who are vulnerable in the community, who need support. You might think of sort of grand democratic institutions as institutions that perform moral labor in a society on a much wider scale. And then there's lots of examples in between. So whenever we put off the moral labor that's needed to keep our social body healthy, we're incurring moral debt, okay? Now, often what allows us to put off that moral labor, as I will explain further in a moment, is relying on new technologies as patches or workarounds or offsets for moral labor that we've been neglecting. So sometimes instead of performing moral labor, we use a technology as what I'll call a moral extender, something to kind of bridge us over the gap for a while. And some kinds of technologies can actually hold indefinitely a society together because they, in a way, replace the moral labor or automate it or allow us to perform it more readily. But there are certain kinds of technologies that don't actually repair the deficits that moral labor would. They just kind of form a temporary patch. They're what in American vernacular we call a Band-Aid solution. In Britain they call them plasters, but right, you just kind of put something over to cover it, but the wound is still there. So I'm most worried, as you'll see, about those kinds of uses of technology to patch moral labor. But there's also moral labor that needs to happen within technical systems. And when that is neglected, the technologies themselves become pernicious, unjust, or otherwise harmful to the health of the social body. And I'll talk about some of those kinds of things as well. So moral debt is a parallel to a related socio-technical phenomenon that's known very well to software engineers. And that's what we call technical debt. So every software engineer should know what that is. But for those of you that aren't software engineers or who haven't encountered the concept of technical debt, I'll go into it a little bit further. So technical debt accrues when the pressure to deliver a working product in a timely and cost-conscious manner leads software designers or engineers to forego the technical measures that would normally be needed to sustain the product's usability, stability, safety, and user trust over the long term, leading to a product that works now, that is, it works when it's delivered, but will require even more costly fixes, harm mitigations, or redesigns later. So technical debt is not an all or nothing thing. As I'll explain, a little bit of technical debt is normal and expected. You can't ship a product that is perfect, because then you will never ship a product. So at some point you have to say, look, we could make this product better, we could make it more resilient, we could make it more stable, but that would mean delaying its release further. So what we're going to do is we're going to release it now. We're going to accept that there will be some work down the road that will need, we will need some updates, some patches, right, or some other improvements to ensure that it can keep going. Okay, so technical debt is not always a bad thing. But technical debt does accrue interest, meaning typically it costs more to keep the product going over time when you have deferred the work up front. So you have to be able to think about whether you're going to be able to afford to do the work on that software product later that's needed to keep it stable, safe, and trustworthy. So the term technical debt, I think, was first coined by Ward Cunningham in 1992. And he says, shipping first-time code is like going into debt. A little debt speeds development as long as it is paid back promptly with a code rewrite. The danger occurs when the debt is not repaid. And he says entire engineering organizations can be brought to a standstill by allowing too much technical debt to accrue in a product or software system. So what are sources of technical debt? Here's a list of some causes of technical debt identified by Ernst et al. In 2015. A poor initial choice of code architecture, overly complex code, what we might sometimes hear engineers call as spaghetti code, lack of adequate code documentation, inadequate testing of the software, the use within the software of obsolete technologies or forms of code that are going to be harder to keep up later. Code dependencies, either on external systems or inter-module code dependencies that create further work and vulnerabilities, unnecessary code duplication, or poor deployment. We can probably identify more. But we're going to be concerned here not so much about technical debt, but its analog, moral debt. So why does, hold on. Okay, so when I talk about moral debt in technical systems, and remember what I said on that slide where I had 3 bullets, and I had as the third one, the fact that moral debt can not only accrue in societies independently of technology, it can actually accrue within technical systems themselves. So why does that happen? Well, largely it accrues because pressure to deliver and deploy a system or application in a timely and profitable manner has led technologists to forego the ethical reflection and ethical design choices needed to sustain system usability, stability, safety, and user and public trust over the long term. So within a technical system, you can have technical debt and moral debt. So the technical debt is, again, those kinds of technical failures or shortcuts that you took in order to get the product out the door that you're going to have to repay later. Moral debt are the moral shortcuts that you took. The moral issues with the product that you didn't spend time thinking about, or that you saw but you didn't spend any time to build in safeguards or mitigations for the moral harm that software might cause. So you let the software out the door, either not looking for the moral risks associated with it, or knowing they were there and not doing anything to address them. And it has similar dimensions to technical debt in that it undermines the system's stability and safety and the ability of people to trust it over the long term. So when you have a technical system that has a great deal of moral debt built up in it, you have a system that's going to require even more burdensome and costly fixes, redesigns. It may be subject to moratoria, regulations, audits, investigations, hearings, and harm compensations later. Moral debt also accrues interest. If you want an example of this, I'll give you one right now. Amazon a year or two ago had to, in response to a number of localities within the United States that had voted to ban facial recognition commercial systems and prevent them from being used by government agencies and policing agencies. in response to a growing number of local voting initiatives that placed moratoria or bans on the use of this technology, Amazon had to institute a voluntary moratorium where it said it would not be selling its facial recognition analysis product to policing agencies for some time. And just recently, Amazon announced that it had extended that moratorium. That's an example of what I'm talking about. When that product was released, there was a massive moral debt associated with it. Amazon did not do the work up front to make sure that that product was going to be safe and trustworthy in the hands of government agencies and police agencies. And so what they've had to do now is basically suspend the sale of that product to those agencies. And it's going to be, in the long run, far costlier to them than if they had done the moral labor up front. But I also want to talk about the way that technology is often deployed by social bodies to compensate for missing moral labor and offset the social costs of accrued moral debt. So this is what I said I would speak about with respect to technologies as moral labor extenders. So I'm going to show you three types. So the first type is the most benign from my standpoint. It's technology that enables moral labor to be performed by people more easily, quickly, or effectively than is otherwise possible. So think about the invention of the telephone, right? One of the things you might do as moral labor in a society is check up on your neighbors and friends and family and see how they're doing, make sure that they're okay, see if they need anything. And the telephone allowed you actually to do that more easily, quickly, and effectively than when you had to get on a horse and ride to the next town to check on somebody. So we have lots of examples of this, technologies that actually enable societies or social bodies to perform moral labor more readily. We also have technologies that, rather than allowing us to do the moral labor more easily, they actually do it for us. So think about, for example, traffic lights, which automate moral labor in a social body. So instead of the police or traffic monitor that has to stand at the intersection all day and wave people through, or alternatively have no safety measures there and allow vehicles to crash into each other and people to get hurt, we've now created these electronic systems that stand in the intersection and do the moral labor for us. But they do it mechanically without there actually being a social presence. But make no mistake, a traffic light is performing moral labor that's part of what a social body needs in order to protect its members. But there's another kind of technology that substitutes for shared moral labor in a social body and replaces it with a different kind of functionality. So think about the ways that markets previously relied on various technologies of a social nature, not a digital nature, but a social nature to monitor trustworthiness in economic exchanges. So we have technologies like legal contracts, but we also have lots of social technologies and sort of informal ways of making sure that the people we trade with, for example, are trustworthy, that they are fulfilling their promises to us. And as we've moved into a market system that is global and where we are trading with people that we will never see or never speak to, we've had to invent all kinds of systems that essentially aren't performing really moral labor at all. But what they're doing is holding the system together and keeping it functional. So we have lots of sort of regimes of kind of automated audits and things like that that allow us to keep systems at least having the kinds of integrity that allows us to use them. So if we think about computing systems as moral extenders, we can see that they come in these three types as well. So if we think about the smartphone, this is a technology that allows us to perform moral labor with each other in the same way that the analog telephone did, but even more, right? We can check on each other in more ways. We can communicate with each other in more ways. We can share our lives with one another in more ways. And so think about the ways that Smartphones allow us, for example, to support our friends and family members, both financially through financial apps that allow us to transfer cash very quickly to a family member in need, or things that allow us to have a sense of when our friends are struggling and allow us to reach out to them more readily. So we have lots of moral labor that our smartphones enable. Doesn't mean there aren't problems with smartphones. I'm just pointing out that a lot of the moral labor that smartphones do is work we're doing through the smartphone. But there are also tools we have for automating moral labor in interesting ways. So think about, for example, the use of text-to-speech technology to allow broadcasts to be made available to audiences that would previously be inaccessible. So if you think about screen reading and how it has enabled people who are blind to be able to read documents that would otherwise have required a human there doing that labor to read to them. Or if you think about the deaf community and the way that speech to text has enabled auto captioning, and previously you would need a human in there doing that sort of signing or other work to allow members of the deaf community to understand broadcast speech. That kind of moral labor can now be automated by computing technologies. They're not perfect, but it does make a lot of cultural content more accessible and more, and it makes this kind of social labor more scalable. But there's another kind of computing technology that does a kind of substitution or patch or run around our moral labor. Think about the kinds of workplace monitoring systems that are increasingly taking over from managerial oversight of the workplace. So think about systems that monitor a workplace and perform not only surveillance, but analysis of workers' movements, forcing them to push themselves into more and more optimal patterns from the software's point of view. There's been much criticism, for example, of Amazon's warehouses and the computer systems that track and analyze and nudge and push workers in those labor environments. And here, what we see is a computer that's not performing moral labor at all. It's not maintaining a sort of healthy work environment. It's just trying to extract the most labor value possible out of workers without thinking about the sort of long-term sustainability for the laborer's body and for the workplace community. So it's really, the computer there is not automating workplace management. It's not doing what the factory floor manager ideally would be doing. It's doing something different that substitutes for that. Okay, so what I'm trying to say with those examples here is that I think more moral debt comes in the third type of moral extension system than you see in the type 1 or type 2. And we're seeing a push, particularly in data and AI-driven technologies, more towards these type 3 extensions, where instead of doing moral labor, we're kind of going around it with technology. And that's increasing the moral debt that we have in our technical systems and in our society. So what's driving this? Well, first of all, I think shared moral labor is less commonly recognized as part of technical work in AI. That's starting to change, but it's very, very slow. AI is still viewed as just a technical challenge in many AI companies, and certainly in many computer science and informatics academic departments. If you compare this with older safety or integrity cultures in other kinds of engineering, civil engineering, biomedical research, aeronautics, in all of these cultures in the 20th century, you saw the necessity of a development of a sense of responsibility to the public interest, to public safety, and ethical codes developed around civil engineering, biomedical research, and aeronautics that were developed from within the professional communities themselves, and in some cases, quite rigidly enforced. And we're not seeing that yet in AI, although we're seeing movements toward it. So when technical cultures are mature, they see moral labor, concern for issues of safety, fairness, accountability, integrity. They see that sort of moral labor as part of the technical profession and part of technical excellence. But we haven't seen that emerge fully yet with AI. In addition, practical AI domain-specific ethical skills are not widely integrated today in computer science curricula, and this contributes to a lack of ethical ownership or confidence. So you see a lot of technologists saying, hey, look, I'm not an ethicist. How am I supposed to know what the ethical issues are with this system that I'm building and handing over to somebody else to deploy at scale? So we have this lack of ethical ownership and confidence. And in some cases, it's justified. In some cases, there really is a low capacity to readily identify ethical risks and reliable ways to manage them because we haven't trained technical professionals in these domains to do it. In some cases, the ability is there, but we've essentially created a culture that says this isn't part of your job. So that has to change. So in addition to training technical professionals to understand that moral labor is part of their role and giving them the capabilities to perform that moral labor well, we have to reward moral labor in technical communities. Right now, we have too few compelling career rewards for investment in ethical skill development in these domains. It's starting to be seen as a nice to have. So if you're a computer scientist who can also speak authoritatively about ethics in computing, if you're an AI researcher who knows a lot about machine learning fairness, that's seen as very nice, but it's not yet seen everywhere that it needs to be as a necessity, as a core skill set. And it's not rewarded in the employment marketplace the way it needs to be. And we also are still seeing a great deal of externalization of the social costs of AI's moral debt to users, to citizens, to vulnerable groups, institutions, and to the public commons. So when moral labor is not performed and harms to the social body ensue, it is not the people who created those harms who pay. So this creates a moral distancing effect, or worse, creates an illusion of what I'll call moral solvency. So if you're developing and deploying AI systems that are having these moral costs on the social body that you've handed the system over to, but you don't see it because you're not part of the vulnerable population that is being treated unfairly by these systems or being, for example, falsely flagged as committing fraud by these systems, you might be shielded from all of that. And so the costs are invisible to the very people who are imposing them. So until those social costs can be re-internalized, just as we have required in the environmental domain for polluters to increasingly have to bear the costs of pollution, you have to re-internalize those externalities, or else you're just incentivizing people to shove the costs of their moral debt onto the social body. So the sources of moral debt in data and AI systems then are lack of adequate user and public stakeholder input into design, development, and deployment. I can't tell you how often every week I see some product released that nobody wants, that nobody asked for. Think about in New York City, the Boston Dynamics robot police dog that was released with great fanfare, and then within a matter of weeks announced that the contract was canceled because New Yorkers said, we don't want police to have robot dogs. That is not what we need. No one outside of perhaps the New York Police Department wanted robot police dogs, and yet an immense amount of money and effort went into developing them and announcing the deal. So until we get more user and public stakeholder input into data and AI systems, so that the technologies we get are actually the technologies people want, we're going to continue to have this moral debt accrue. There's also inadequate analysis of dual use potential, right? We don't think enough about how is this technology going to be used in ways that we didn't plan for, we didn't intend. So we might, for example, have a technology that looks very benign initially, but when we actually release into the world, suddenly it's being abused and used in all kinds of harmful ways. Often it's possible to anticipate those dual uses, but software designers and developers and AI researchers often aren't encouraged to think about dual use potential. And that leads to an absence of rigorous moral hazard analysis, right? If you are an engineer in many fields, you're expected to do a safety hazard analysis where you think about what are the ways this product could hurt people. And there's legal liability if you don't perform that safety hazard analysis and take the necessary precautions. We need to start requiring the same kind of moral hazard analysis for data-driven innovation in AI systems. And part of that means testing for accuracy and fairness for diverse users. There was just a story came out today in Vice magazine about Google's new AI-powered dermatology app that was developed to help people determine whether a skin condition or lesion they have might be high risk, whether they should go to a doctor. And it turns out that it wasn't trained on very dark skin tones and is unlikely then to work reliably well for people with dark brown or black skin. That should never have happened. And yet it happens routinely. We have no user education for these products, often on their limitations, their risks, their known failure modes, and inappropriate uses. This should be standard. Until we do it, every AI system that goes out without this kind of user education is accruing more moral debt. When we do know these problems, we often postpone their known harm mitigations. So for example, Google has admitted that it knew full well that the training data set for the dermatology app was not sufficiently diverse, but they are basically saying, well, it's a problem, we're trying, but they're not actually putting the mitigations in place to prevent people from getting harmed. For example, there's no mode of the product that basically tells people with darker skin tones that they shouldn't use it. There's no routine post-deployment monitoring for unanticipated behaviors, interactions, and harms. AI products still ship, they go out the door, and there's nobody whose job it is to make sure that they're not causing harm in unexpected ways. That needs to change. So how do we pay down the moral debt in our technical systems? I'm about to wrap up. Here's what we need to do. We need to remodel data and AI cultures and accountability structures. We need to use as a template those technical domains I spoke of earlier, where innovation is highly valued, but moral debt is less easily tolerated. Domains like aerospace and aviation, civil and mechanical engineering, biomedical engineering. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We need to go beyond these safety cultures because the kinds of risks that AI pose are not just physical risks. But nevertheless, we can get started by looking at how other domains of technical practice have taken up responsibilities for public safety and for a kind of moral integrity in technology development and deployment. So we need to start that in AI and other emerging technology cultures. We need to integrate practical AI and data ethics education throughout computer science curricula. And I'm not talking about one-off ethics courses where, okay, here's your ethics course, you're done, you're never going to be asked to use this knowledge again. No, we need to expand the definition of core technical competence to include ethical reflection, care, and moral creativity in design. Emerging technology conferences, leading AI conferences like NeurIPS are now starting to require researchers to declare the ethical risk implications of the work that they're submitting. And this is a great step forward. It's created some controversy, but this is the sort of thing that needs to happen. But you can't require researchers to do that if they haven't been trained to do it. So now we need to put that training into place so that every computer scientist, every AI researcher, everyone who's developing these kinds of tools knows how to do the ethical work that's required. We need to re-internalize the moral externalities of AI innovation. Those who negligently impose moral harms on AI users or society have to have stark incentives not to do it, whether that's loss of reputation and career opportunity, or whether that's exposure to legal penalties or market penalties or requirements for restitution to those harmed. Until those externalities fall upon the people who create the harm, we will never pay down this moral debt. And finally, we need to embrace the aim of moral solvency in data and AI practice, not the illusion of it, but the reality of it. We need to consider that innovative AI deployments today are being held back more by growing public distrust and fear of AI and resulting lack of stakeholder cooperation than they are by a lack of good ideas or talent. There's plenty of very intelligent, very talented people working on AI today. What's going to prevent them from doing the work that they want to do is the lack of moral solvency, the moral debt that we have accrued in this AI culture. And until that moral debt starts to get paid down, it's going to hold back, and necessarily so, hold back innovation. And so in conclusion, when people talk about ethics, they sometimes describe it as a roadblock or an impediment to innovation. And quite the opposite. What I hope I've convinced you of is that ethics in technology cultures, and specifically in the development of data and AI, is not a roadblock to innovation. It's actually the only path forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shannon. That was a splendid presentation. I would say an introduction or a kickoff for what will follow. We are already receiving questions, but to our audience, I would say hold your horses over on YouTube or on the other channels you're attending this seminar. We will have the Q&A session after this second part of today's seminar. And now I yield the floor to Aude, who will introduce Sam Lavigne. And thank you again, Shannon.
Yes, thank you so much, Shannon. So now we'll listen to Sam Lavigne. Sam is an artist and educator whose work deals with data surveillance, natural language processing, and automation. He has exhibited at the Lincoln Center, the San Francisco MoMA, the Arts Electronica Festival, the New Museum, the Smithsonian American Art Museum. He has taught at ITP NYU, the New School, the School for Poetic Computation, and is currently an assistant professor at the Austin, Texas University. So I've been actually a long-time fan of his work, so I'm especially thrilled to have him with us tonight. And Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you so much for having me, and Shannon, thanks for that that wonderful talk. I do a lot of programming, so like anytime someone says the word technical debt, it's like, yes, that's actually mostly what I'm doing. So let me just share my screen, and here we go. Great. Perfect. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my practice. I'll walk you through some of my projects. And I guess I should say, like, in relation to the topic of the day, my interests are a little bit less about AI and machine learning as such, and perhaps more about that broader category that encompasses them, which is simply automation, right? And I think that there's a lot of obviously there's obviously a lot of hype around machine learning and AI, and there's also a lot of mystification around it. And for me, just sort of framing it in terms of automation helps. I mean, automation has its own set of mystiques, right? But it helps a little bit demystify what I'm interested in, what my angle is when I deal with those kinds of systems. I guess even more specifically, I'm really interested in that thing which gives rise to automation, or what enables automation, which is data collection. And I am by no means a labor historian, but it is kind of interesting to think about how even, like someone like Taylor, right, when he's inventing Taylorism, is obsessed with data collection, right? So it's like, it's always been part of this story of automation, is also a story of data collection. And, Taylor, what he's doing is he's like looking at the workers and like sort of meticulously inspecting their body movements to see if he can reproduce what they're doing physically in a more automated way, right? Yeah, and the other thing I'll say about automation is that I think it's quite important to frame it not in terms of efficiency, but in terms of power. So, a story, or one story around automation is that it's about the increase in efficiency. And it does, of course, at times increase efficiency. But I would say it's more useful to think about automation in terms of consolidating control and power, right? So the question wouldn't be, does facial recognition, for example, allow the police to more effectively arrest suspects? The question is, who does facial recognition empower and who does it disempower, right? Okay, so most of my work is online. Most of it is sort of about the internet. And I frequently use a technique called web scraping. Web scraping just means when you write a program to browse the web on your behalf instead of doing it like yourself. So for example, like if I wanted to get all the headlines on the front page of the New York Times, I could just go to the website, I could write down all the headlines in pen and paper, copy paste them into an Excel sheet or whatever, or I could use web scraping. I could write a program that does that for me. So it's just a way to automate your own web browsing. And this interest in web scraping for me is really motivated by a question of how we can come to terms with the fact that everything we do online and to a great degree offline as well is tracked, it's exploited, it's mined for profit, and that all of these individual, seemingly ephemeral traces that we leave behind are converted into structured data, and they're stored in perpetuity, right? So that these human experiences that we're having, mediated by machines, right, are converted into predictive models and into business models. And this, of course, leads to a broader question about what should be a commodity and what shouldn't be a commodity, right? What we allow as a society to be bought and sold. One response to this prevailing model of the internet and not the internet is to attempt to perform some kind of inversion, to exploit the fact that power, even as we leave our traces online, like power also leaves its traces online. And that through collecting, processing, filtering, and sorting these traces or data, certain truths can become visible and they can crystallize into something. This inversion is something that I've been calling scrapism, which is just a word I made up. It doesn't, whatever, scrapism, right? And I define it as the use of web scraping and data collection as an artistic or cultural practice. So scrapism combines data journalism, conceptual art, and archiving, very importantly, archiving, in an attempt to extract data from behind all these various web interfaces that mediate our lives, to relocate it and to relocate it for emotional, critical, or poetic ends, right? So to attempt to directly engage in that power struggle with data. So many of the projects I'm going to show you, basically all of them, kind of end up being data archives, right? And they're archives that make manifest the consequences of commodification, or perhaps like as Shannon would say, like the sort of the consequences of this moral debt, right? I should just also note before I get into the projects that most of these are very, very US focused. So I apologize in advance for it being particularly sort of like rooted in like a US context. And with that, I'll just get going. And the first project I'll show you is called Baba. And it's just an archive of things that are for sale on Alibaba.com, right? So Alibaba, as I'm sure you all know, is this massive e-commerce platform based in China, and it allows you to buy goods directly from the manufacturer. I really love it because it's sort of like, here's all of capitalism. Like here it all is. Here's like every single commodity. And so in this project, as in many of my projects, I go to a website and I start to type in a search term that I think is in some way unusual. So this project is simply an index of commodities that you might not expect to find on Alibaba. And here, for example, is every single item of riot gear that's for sale. This list is sorted by minimum order price from highest on the left to lowest on the right, and visualized in terms of a kind of minimum order quantity. So if I go over here, I can see that it's quite large, kind of scroll around, and then you can also kind of like, zoom in different areas. and take a kind of closer look at each of the products. One of the other quite disturbing things for sale on Alibaba is actually human labor. This may not be the case anymore, but when I made this project, you are able to search for laborers that you could order for your job site. These laborers might include housemaids, construction workers, nannies, or sort of more generic terms like manpower, right? My interest in this is the way in which Alibaba itself is just revealing a very simple, perhaps very obvious truth about capitalism, which is that labor, according to their terms, is a commodity that's indistinguishable from any other commodity. There's a kind of flattening that happens. And it's a similar flattening that happens in this next project I'll show you, which is called 3 Degrees of Separation from the Military Industrial Prison Data Surveillance State. So this is a project about LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the social network owned by Microsoft. It's a social network for people with jobs, right? So you upload your resume, you put in your skills, and people, recruit you, and you make professional connections, right? In this project, what I did is I started to search for phrases again that I wasn't necessarily expecting to have any results for. So I put in a word like counterterrorism or surveillance or enforcement or interrogation. And what I came up with was a map of people within 2 or 3 degrees of separation from myself on LinkedIn who had been endorsed at being good at these skills. So for example, this guy right here, William Flores, Texas Ranger, and he has been endorsed by other people on the network 794 times as being a good interrogator, right? And again, what's going on here, what LinkedIn is telling us, the commentary that LinkedIn itself in a way is making, is that there's a sort of flattening of skills, right? And so, someone like who is very good at surveillance might also be really good at Photoshop, right? But in the labor marketplace, they're all equivalent, right? So like you could kind of like assemble like your own private police, right? Just by sort of doing these simple searches. And that's me there in the middle. Okay. If I'm going too long or too short, well, if I'm going too long, please interrupt me. So this next project is a bit difficult to talk about. This is I worked with a journalist named Merav Zanzin for The Nation magazine, and Merav was investigating. She was investigating homes that were in occupied territory in Israel that then showed up on Airbnb, right? So this is a situation, of course, in which Palestinians are forced to leave their homes. And then in some cases, those homes end up on Airbnb listed as vacation rentals, right? And it's, again, a situation in which, your own home is listed on Airbnb, but you're physically actually prevented from going there. So all this project is, again, an archive. And it starts with a map. And then there's a section that contains all of the sentences and all of the listings, just sorted alphabetical, that you can sort of go through. And then all of the images from all of the listings. So I don't think I need to speak that much about this, but I think it sort of speaks for itself in a way. and kind of continuing this line about, right, what are the some of the consequences of the commodification of housing. I made another recent project. This is a collaboration with Tiga Brain, who I work with a lot. And this is called New York Apartment. So whereas like that Airbnb project took a small slice of Airbnb to reveal a sort of political dynamic that was at play, New York Apartment represents the totality of New York real estate. So this is a website that combines every single for sale real estate listing in New York into one single fictional space. So it's like if you combined every single apartment for sale in New York and stuck them together, the cost would be $43 billion. There'd be 65,000 bedrooms, 55,000 bathrooms, 36 million square feet. And then what we try to do is kind of break apart every element of a real estate listing. So we begin with these questions, like all of the questions in all of the listings, right? Like, are you looking to get into a home? Are you a discerning home buyer? Are you priced out of other neighborhoods? Are you ready for the next level? Are you ready for this one? Are you ready to fall in love? Are you ready to make an investment in this amazing neighborhood, and so on? And then it's all of the images. So it's like 20,000 images of bedrooms, right? We can sort of go through them. 17,000 images of bathrooms, 14,000 images of kitchens, 8,000 dining rooms, and so on and so on. And my favorite section, which is the gyms, 2,000 images of gyms. And then again, it sort of just keeps going. So it's like all the sentences again that start with the phrase, the apartment, right? And then also, you know, what else is in a real estate listing? Floor plans. So we downloaded all the floor plans and then extruded them using actually like a machine learning system, and then combined them back together to form these virtual 3D spaces that represent, again, sort of just like if you stuck all the apartments together, what would it look like, right? So you can kind of like explore these nearly endless spaces. And then not finally, video tours. I don't think I have sound on, so I won't bother playing these, but these are like super cuts of all of the videos that come with the listings, right? So like every time someone says welcome, right? Every time someone says the apartment, every time someone says bedroom, every time someone says master, right? And so on. Adjective nouns, the mortgage calculator, which is one of my favorite aspects of this, which tells you what your estimated monthly payment would be. And then it ends with a list of all the real estate agents. Originally, I had it so that you could hit a button and it would put you into like a massive group chat with every single real estate agent in New York. But I was asked by the organization that commissioned this piece to remove that for obvious reasons. And so this is kind of like, again, like this is just what happens when real estate is a commodity instead of a right, right? And what's like the sort of totality and what's the sort of totality of that real estate as commodity. The next work, also an archive. This one is called Get Well Soon. And it's sort of like a giant, e-card made from well wishes that were scraped from the website GoFundMe. So again, like I think this is a fairly US specific situation. GoFundMe.com is a crowdfunding website. It's used primarily to raise money for medical expenses. So, you know, many people in the US either don't have insurance or they have not very good insurance. And so if they're in a medical situation, they simply can't afford it. And so GoFundMe is sort of filling this gap, maybe this moral debt. And it allows you to create a fundraising campaign for anything you want to, but most specifically for medical fundraisers. So you make a listing, you describe your condition, say how much money you're trying to raise, and then you effectively perform, you perform your trauma to your friends and your family and they donate money to cover your medical expenses. So to make this page, we scraped GoFundMe looking for various disease names, and then we downloaded the comments from each of those fundraising pages. And what we end up with is 200,000 sentences grouped and sorted alphabetically. And of course, this is a somewhat contradictory archive, right? On the one hand, it's an archive that contains messages of genuine solidarity and hope, right? And on the other hand, it's an archive that should not exist at all, right? Because its existence is the product of a terrible systemic failure. I could read just a little bit to you. All the best guys, all the absolute best dude, all the absolute very best, all the angels and saints will be at your side, all the best baby girl, all the best honey, all the best to you and the family, all the best, 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 all the best cousin, all the best, and enjoy every moment you have, all the best and good luck, and so on. This project is accompanied by an essay by Johanna Hedva, a writer and artist based in Berlin. I think a very beautiful essay that I encourage you to read. That's about the language of care and the language of revolution. Great. And I think the last project I'll mention is called white collar crime risk zones. So those sort of previous works are really, I guess you could call them like editorialized archives, right? Some kind of like critical archive. This last project is more, I suppose, more directly addresses AI and machine learning. And in a way, you know, when you're making an AI project, what you're actually doing is you're making an activated archive, right? It's like an archive that's put into practice. So white collar crime risk zones is a predictive policing application that targets white collar crime. What is predictive policing? Again, actually, I'm not sure how prevalent this is outside of the US. In the US, it's extremely prevalent. Predictive policing systems make predictions about where and when crime will occur based on data about where crimes have already occurred. So this is a real predictive policing system, a screenshot from an application called HunchLab, which actually I believe is now no longer in use. But you can see it's a map, right? And we get the software predicting that there's a really high likelihood of larceny, which is theft of personal property, on the green square, right? As I'm sure we all know, you know, these machine learning systems are only as good as the data you give them, right? They're like completely bound by the training data, right? And so by necessity, they will reinforce and reproduce biases in their training data. I think that, you know, there's a scale of harm when we talk about these systems. Predictive policing is particularly dangerous, particularly harmful, right? The consequences are, first of all, so dire, but also the data that they're generated on, right? The data is being produced by systemically racist police departments, right? So they create this terrible feedback loop of over policing communities of color, and they do so with a veil of scientific objectivity, right? So a really interesting element to these systems is that sometimes the people who make them think that they are actually mitigating the problems, right? So in a way, you know, one could make an argument, it's not my argument, but one could make an argument that says, oh, well, the police are it's actually going to, you know, help mitigate racism because the police will be forced to make decisions based on a computational system rather than their own individual biases, right? And I think that that's a way in which a lot of these sort of systems, that's a fairly common narrative in these systems. There are also people who just are actually malicious, but I think that, there's a sort of blindness to it. Okay? So in response to predictive policing, we decided to make our own predictive policing app that uses the exact same techniques and methodologies that these real systems use, but we flipped the data set. So instead of using data about street crime, we put in data from FINRA, which is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. It's a non-governmental organization that is sort of like the financial industry policing itself, essentially. So we downloaded thousands of PDFs, looking for instances where FINRA had fined organizations for a variety of violations. And then we produced a machine learning model capable of predicting the likelihood of white-collar crime, financial crime, with an accuracy of 90%, which is actually like better than industry standard, I would say. So here's what it looks like. This was, by the way, for the New Inquiry magazine, collaboration with Brian Clifton and Francis Singh. Here's a map of New York. The rectangles are indicating locations where the system predicts a high likelihood of white-collar crime. The redder and darker the square, the higher the danger level. Clicking on different squares gives you more information, which includes what types of crime the model predicts will occur, as well as the severity of the crime and nearby financial firms who might be kind of like institutional suspects. We also show this composite image of a most likely individual white-collar criminal suspect. This is a facial average of high-level financial executives who work in the area that we've scraped from LinkedIn. And the joke here, of course, is that each composition is unique, but they all look almost exactly the same. So the map, again, very US specific. It covers the whole US, and then it's accompanied by an iPhone app that will send you push notifications when you enter a high-risk zone for white-collar crime. So I'll just conclude by saying that with white-collar crime risk zones, we're hoping to achieve for wealth what typical policing has achieved for poverty, which is to say we hope to criminalize it. And I think I'll leave my presentation at that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for this detailed presentation. We'll proceed to the Q&A now. So please drop any question you may have in the chat. If you're more comfortable with asking your own questions in your own language, be it French, Italian, or Spanish, I think Antonio and I will be able to translate them for our guests. And for any other language, I'm afraid you will have to rely on some automated translation service, which could be a funny wink at our topic. So please proceed.
Thank you all. I really hope that nobody will ask questions in Italian. But having said that, really, thank you very much, Sam. That was really, really beautiful, and so many questions and well, about the model of the last project you presented. But I'm particularly interested in the Alibaba project, especially the part where you discover that so much commodified human labor was actually negotiated on that platform, which is not surprising at all for me, because I study labor platforms. But again, to find it over there, it's quite interesting. Anyways, we do have a good number of questions that have arrived through the chat on the Gaîté Lyrique website, on YouTube, on Facebook, and also because we had a few glitches, a few technical problems at the beginning, even by email. Somebody that decided to rely on good old email. So let me start by actually one question that I personally have. This is my privilege to ask a question to Shannon Vallor, which is about education, actually. It's an underlying theme in your presentation and in your take on moral debt. The point is, when you say that education is probably not attentive in the US and also in the Scottish and British environment, you are now familiar with, not attentive to the ethical part of the training of data scientists, engineers, and scientists in general. It kind of resonated with my own continental European experience, especially here in France. There is a strong discourse about the French way to engineering, which basically consists in providing some basic skills to data scientists and technologists in general, which is sometimes this basic skills, this basic training in ethics or in philosophy or in sociology of technologies is just enough for them to look like the competent version of an engineer, or probably an incompetent versions of a competent man. Anyways. This to me is somehow problematic, because we do have data scientists here who want to talk about ethics and who feel skilled enough or competent enough because they received some basic training. So my question would be, yes, educating, yes, training, but what should we and how much should we teach ethics in engineering curriculum or in other faculties such as this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So I'm excited to see and encouraged to see how much interest there is growing around improving what passes for ethics education in technical curricula. And most people I've talked to agree that it's necessary and know that the way we've been doing it is inadequate. Where it's done, it's often, as I've mentioned, done as this sort of one-off course that students take, and they know it doesn't matter. They get all the signals that it doesn't matter, right? Those skills and that knowledge that they acquire to pass that course are never called upon in the next course that they take, which will be a purely, technical skill development. And so one of the things that there are a lot of different programs working on this, but I'll call out some I'm familiar with in the United States. Mozilla funded the Responsible CS Challenge, which they just released a handbook that compiles the insights of multiple grantees, different university teams, including my former university that was one of the grantees, experimenting with different ways of implementing ethics into computer science education and seeing what works. Harvard has had an embedded ethics in CS program going as well for a couple of years now that has developed some really interesting ideas. There's some scholars who've been devoted to kind of collecting the growing wisdom around this. So there's a lot more activity and a lot more knowledge and new ideas and examples of things that work to draw upon. But I will say one of the most important things is to make sure that those skills are integrated elsewhere into the curriculum. So for example, if you have a senior design project as part of an engineering program or computing program, there has to be an ethics component built into that. It has to be the case that the ethical knowledge is not only learned, but incentivized and rewarded in the same way that other technical skills are built upon and deepened throughout the course of a technical education. I will also say that it's important to not do it at a high level of abstraction where you're just teaching ethical theory to engineers. I mean, I'm a philosopher. I think taking a course in ethical theory, a course in moral philosophy is great, but that's not going to do it. That's not sufficient. And it's arguably not even always necessary. But you do need a course that actually understands the kind of foundations of ethical reasoning, but you need a course that applies it to technical contexts and technical challenges. I will say that one of the things that I often emphasize, though, is that education is one of the necessary pieces, but you can't expect education to be a silver bullet. It's not going to fix the problem by itself. And I identified 4 things that need to be changed. There might be more than 4, but at the very least, I would say those 4 things I went through: education, changing the incentives, career incentives, and the various other kinds of things I mentioned. Without all 4 of these, I don't think anything really changes that much. And it's like, if you have a bicycle, you know, you need both wheels and the bike chain and the pedals. And you can't say, oh, look, we made this bike wheel even better. Look how much better this bike wheel is. Yes, but do you have the other bike wheel? If you don't have the other wheel on the bicycle, it doesn't matter how good this wheel is, right? The front wheel can be the best wheel that ever was built. And if you don't have the back wheel on, it's not going to work. And if you don't have the chain on, it's not going to work. So we have to think about the ethics challenge here as that kind of problem. We need to identify the essential components and make sure that they are all brought together.
Thank you very much. That was extremely clear. I wonder what would be the steering part of the bicycle there. But anyways, okay. Among the questions, let's start with a question which is for both of you, actually. Which comes from, for Marie-Lou Barbier from YouTube. Well, she's not from YouTube. She asked the question on YouTube. If companies, governments find an interest in the unfair use of these technologies, for instance, social control, marketing performance, etc., she asks, what counterpowers or systemic forces could oblige these institutions to address the moral debt problem? In other words, if companies must care about technical debt, which may cause obsolescence, dysfunction, and eventually an increase of costs, how can we ensure that there is an advantage in taking the moral debt in charge?
Yeah, this is a hard problem. I'll be brief and let Sam offer his thoughts, but we haven't gotten governments to address actually the technical debt problem either. That is, governments are notorious for purchasing large, costly computing systems that are laden with obscene amounts of technical debt, and then the system has to be replaced in a few years because it doesn't work or it's not interoperable with other systems. So I think what we need to think about is we need a lot more technical expertise and sophistication in government as well. So we need governments to have a lot more awareness of, and they need to be properly incentivized. But with respect to the moral debt issue, I think we also need voters in democratic countries to demand this kind of consideration, and we need to change the incentives through regulation. And in some cases, there has to be even a change to the way we think about markets and business. So a lot of companies will say, look, we can only go so far with this ethics stuff because at some point our shareholders could sue us for being more concerned about ethics than profit, which they are legally entitled to have. And so we might need to also think more broadly about how is the economic system going to be sustainable if companies not only are not incentivized to build sustainably for the public interest, but are actually at risk if they do. So some of these bigger incentives really need to get looked at by policymakers.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know the sorts of changes that can happen are you know the same. You know they can happen by the same mechanisms they would happen in any context, right? So it's you know and it sort of depends what your theory of change is, I guess, right? You know, for me, I'm more oriented towards sort of mass movements and you know like a kind of a bottom-up approach, right? And I think that that's been really effective in certain municipalities when you're dealing with things like facial recognition in the US in particular. I mean, there's a long way to go. I think part of the problem also, and again, you know, yeah, part of the problem is that some of these tools are, first of all, some of them are very mystified, right? I mentioned that. It's hard to understand what they're actually doing. And also sometimes, you know, they're not spectacular, right? So you mentioned the robot dog. you know, like you police robot, like, of course, I mean, like, that's such an easy thing to be mad at, right? You're like, oh, it's literally from the movie The Terminator, you know, like there's no like, it's just so easy, right? And I think that a lot of the technologies, however, are like far more insidious, right? And then it becomes more difficult for people to even begin to make the connection that they should be mad about them, that there needs to be pushback. I also think that like a company like Facebook or a company like Google is never going to make the right decision. And, you know, there's no amount of incentive. They're just never going to make a good decision, right? It's not in their interest to. Maybe they'll make some gestures. They'll do it in a way that doesn't affect their bottom line. And they'll always try to figure out how to continue to exploit these data systems in any way they can. So I have like zero faith or confidence in the organizations themselves to do anything proper, you know. And in the face of that, yeah, there's two options. There's regulation and there's like boycott also. But I mean, there is a way in which there's just a fundamental it's just incompatible, right? There's to have like the ends of justice and a profit motive are almost, they're so fundamentally incompatible in so many scenarios that it's hard to imagine. It's hard to really imagine mitigating these problems unless you're also mitigating capitalism in some way.
Okay, before I ask another question to Sam Lavigne, let me just take the last thing you mentioned, Sam, to bridge for the next two questions. I decided to group together two questions, one coming from colleague Paula Tubero and one from an anonymous LA8364. Anyway, I won't read their name. They're actually more, how can we say, possibilistic, meaning that they are open to possibilities of collaboration, of goodwill anyway, from the companies. The first one is, do you know of any countries, this is for Shannon Vallor, of course, that require large tech companies to have their products evaluated by a committee of experts to think about moral debt effects before they put their products on the market? Or does everything depend on the goodwill of companies? So this is less about regulation or government. This seems to be more like an internal audit from the companies. And the other, let's say, I don't know. I think that they resonate this question. These questions. The second one is, I understand that in your view, Shannon Vallor's view, the recent hype about AI ethics and fairness, etc., is far from sufficient. I would add that probably this is what you described as a band-aid solution. Who knows? However, do you think there are any parts of it, meaning the AI ethics, that at least go in the right direction? Or, and if so, which ones? Also, do you see any difference in this respect between public research and private companies? Thank you in advance.
Yeah, that's a lot. So I don't know if I can address, that was essentially three questions. So I'll try to touch on them all. With respect to the question about governments requiring companies to do this kind of technology assessment, not that I'm aware of, at least not in that sense, where the company itself would be legally required to create its own internal body of assessment. There are in many countries the equivalent of offices of technology assessment that take on from a public standpoint the responsibility of doing certain kinds of technology risk assessment. But that work has not been mandated typically to be done by companies when we're not talking about sort of just safety issues, when we're talking about sort of moral issues having to do with impacts on social justice and fairness. No, I'm not aware of that requirement. There's also an interesting question about how should companies who do this set up these organizations? So there's been a lot of discussion of Facebook's oversight board and to the extent to which they are independent. And is that a good thing? Is that not a good thing? How independent can they be and actually have force on Facebook's, have the authority to make decisions that Facebook has to follow. Again, some of these corporate governance structures make it really hard to figure out how that works. Whereas you can have an in-house team that's doing this, but as you saw at Google, that in-house team is also subject to power structures above it. And if there isn't sufficient will from the top to empower those teams and act on the knowledge they generate, then it becomes window dressing or ethics washing, right? On the other hand, and this is where the questioner was asking about positive things, I don't think that all of this work is that has been done inside companies is worthless. And full disclosure, I spent a year and a half partially seconded to Google in their cloud AI division as an AI ethicist. So I have experience doing this kind of work inside a large technical organization. And I can say that great things can be done, but you absolutely need that support that goes all the way to the top of the company. And if that fails, right, nothing else beneath it can get through. So I'm not completely pessimistic in the sense that I have met so many people at so many technology companies who really want to do these kinds of projects in the right way, who really, most people do not want to create harmful technologies. Most people want to be empowered and incentivized to create truly beneficial technologies. Most people in technology companies actually want the resources to be able to go out and talk to users and talk to stakeholders and have their input shape the design. The problem is that the incentives and the resources right now, for the reasons that have been mentioned about the profit incentives being misaligned, those resources aren't given to the teams that actually want to be empowered to do that work. So I think it's possible to change these cultures. And I do think that there are some examples, going to Sam's point, they're small and isolated and fragile examples, but there are examples of where profit motivations can be aligned with the public interest. So for example, when air travel was being built in the 1960s and 70s as a commercial industry, the airlines had to invest heavily in engineering safety cultures, and they had to work closely with regulators and government safety oversight bodies in order to make sure that the constraints were there to ensure that planes got safer and safer, because more people would fly as planes got safer and safer. And unfortunately, what you saw with the Boeing 737 MAX debacle is that that kind of system is fragile. You can allow those incentives to degrade in the wrong direction, and then companies are allowed to police themselves without any true oversight, and then they start caring about the bottom line, and they think that that illusion of moral solvency comes in, where they already think they're great, they already think they're safe, and they think they can cut these corners. So it's hard to do, but it's possible to align business with the public interest. And my view is, business is a legitimate social enterprise only if it does end up being compatible with human flourishing, right? A market is not legitimate, is not legitimized by a law of nature. It's legitimized by social permission. And the social permission for markets to operate as they do should only go so far as markets serve the interests of people. And right now, they're not doing a great job of it.
Thank you very much, Shannon. So I decided to put together two questions which revolve around unnecessary technology, useless technology. The first one is direct. We know who asked the question. I mean, we can cite, we can mention her name. Harsh is one student of the HESS seminar, and she asks, I have a question for Professor Vallor about the many unnecessary technological products that are put on the market every day. Is there a possibility of assessing products' value for good, brackets, in an amoral, brackets, capitalistic system driven by investors' money rather than human needs? Adding to that, does it confirm the theory of a growing financial bubble around the digital industry? The other question is actually asked by email by a student who decided to remain anonymous, so I will respect their will. And it's actually about something that I am partially responsible in. When I sent out the message announcing this seminar, I announced, of course, that Sam Lavigne would be with us, and I mentioned among the other projects that he produced, one project that was implemented a few years ago called the Stupid Shit No One Needs and Terrible Ideas Hackathon, which according to the students seemed to resonate with the example that you both mentioned of the New York City robot dog that nobody wanted. So probably it's just an invitation to develop on that, Sam. Let's put it like this.
Is there a question about the hackathon, or is it just
it's just could you please
it.
Yeah, I'm translating from French, so could you please develop? That's what I did.
Yeah, sure. So when I was in grad school, I mean, it's obvious if you follow a lot of sort of tech news. I'm quite obsessed with hate reading Y Combinator, like Hacker News, which is where a lot of Silicon Valley investors and people who are invested in go and post terrible comments and stuff. And so you look at all of these tech products, and of course most of them are in fact useless. But there's also like a sort of joy in the inutility of it. So we made this this one-day event where participants are tasked with producing a technical project that has no value whatsoever, and then are judged at the end of it based on that criteria. Which is now, we did it for a few years. Now I'm not doing it anymore, but like other people, I think, continue to do these like stupid hackathons, and your student or anyone else listening is more than welcome to organize one themselves. And it's a fairly simple critique of Silicon Valley, where instead of asking people to produce solutions, you're asking them to produce problems. And sometimes the projects that come out of it are very silly, and sometimes they're quite, I think, quite like insightful critiques. So, for example, we a few years ago had a participant create an application that looked on Facebook. It tried to determine how rich or poor your friends were on Facebook based on using a machine learning model, and then would automatically unfriend all of your poor friends, right? And so that kind of satire, obviously it's awful. I mean, that sort of satirical gesture is really pointing to the way that these tools are used, right? And I think there's a lot of opportunity in satire. I certainly find it like rich territory, right? To figure out like what's going on with these systems, because it kind of, when you're satirizing a technical system, you're also reverse engineering it, right? And that gives you a real understanding, both on a technical level, but also on a psychic level about what's going on, right? So I find it a quite useful event. And even though I don't organize the project anymore, I find myself every once in a while making stupid hackathon projects in my spare time. So for example, I made an application that it's like a little thing that runs in your menu bar or system tray, and it just deletes Zoom. So, it deletes Zoom, and then if you try to reinstall it, it'll just keep deleting Zoom over and over again. It's called the Zoom deleter, Anyway, I think it's sort of there's a lot of kind of interesting stuff there. But one last thing I'll say is like a lot of these, so like a lot of these technical systems, they always are bad at first too. Like what was Uber? Uber was really, unusable at first, right? It was for really, really rich people. It was extremely expensive, right? And not very useful, because it's not useful to get into like $100 cab for most people, right? And then what happens is they have so much money coming into them that they're then eventually able to lower the prices, take over the market, and then completely destroy whatever came before them, right? And then they can do whatever they want back to the prices again. So I think that there's like, you have to be like a little bit like you're a little bit careful with some of these organizations that seem really dumb at first, and then they can evolve through sheer force of capital into a real something that really has a tremendous amount of power.
I'll just add briefly to that. I think one of the costs that we have paid of divorcing scientific and technical education and culture from the arts and humanities and social sciences is the impoverishment of imagination in the technical sphere. And I think what Sam's talking about really speaks to that. In terms of hate reading, just today I was looking at a tweet from somebody who retweeted a Mercedes ad that was talking about the next version of their vehicles and how many different screens were in the cabin of the car. And you have a driver who it looks like a carnival or an 80s video game inside this Mercedes. It's lights everywhere, screens, lights, and there's no way you could functionally drive that car at night. You would drive into a tree immediately, right? But and so people, the whole thread was just people ripping on this and talking about what terrible lack of design intelligence was reflected in this. And so it's not just about AI, it's really a broader issue that we have with what it means to be an excellent technologist. And we've allowed it to get so far away from, human needs and values that we end up just laughing at it. As Sam pointed out, this kind of satire, sometimes all you can do is just laugh. But that's indicative of a pretty sad place we've gotten if our best scientific and technical minds can't figure out better ways to make people happy and live well. So isn't it? Mm-hmm. Sam,
isn't it also like a domain question? Like a lot of there's like not that many there's not that many useful applications for a lot of these technologies. You just like kind of make something up and you try to like stick it into a hole that it doesn't really properly fit into. And the thing that's pushing it is all that money, right?
Well, there's more to technology than apps, right? I mean, that's part of it too, that's that limitation of our imagination where all we can think is to add another app or add another screen.
I'm happy that you both are focusing on the fact that this lack of need probably is points towards the fact that probably we are not using technology to address needs in general, and which is somehow an implicit criticism of one of the notions that I personally despise the most, which is solutionism, technical solutionism, which is very used, especially in France, as a way of, as a one-size-fits-all notion. Anyway, before we end officially, our time is over, but given the fact that we had some minor technical problems at the beginning, I would like to ask one final question, which again is for Shannon. Basically, the question emphasizes the centrality of the illusion of moral solvency in the way you characterize moral debt, and the way you describe the illusion of moral solvency is that you don't see the costs or the way other people are adversely affected by this technological solution because you are not part of the population affected, which brings to mind also another approach, which is Safiya Noble's approach of algorithms of oppression. So what would be your take on that? Do you see that these two approaches, these two notions can resonate together?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we need to think about is there's a way of thinking about technology and thinking about human needs that is increasingly coming to be recognized by people as part of what it means to have technologies developed in ways that are not just fair, but just. Of course, Safiya Noble and Ruha Benjamin and others have done a tremendous amount of work sort of getting us past this notion of, technology that's fair in the sense that, it meets some sort of standard of individual parity or equitable treatment, and then thinking about how it actually affects the social dynamics of our world, of our power systems, of our institutions. And so many technologies, you know, when you look at them on the individual level, they might seem benign, but when you look at how they are reshaping society and changing the power balances in society, you can see tremendous harms building up. So what I think is really interesting is there's a slogan that kind of came out of disability advocacy, nothing about us without us. And basically, because disabled people were constantly being told, oh, look, we built exoskeletons for you. And so many people in the disability community were like, did we ask for exoskeletons? No, we asked for curb cuts so our wheelchairs can actually move around, but you can't build us ramps or curb cuts, but you're going to give us exoskeletons we don't want. And we understand, you know, why those things won't work as well for us as the kinds of technological changes that we keep asking for. And so this idea that if you're going to design something for a particular community, that community should be behind it. They should be driving it. They should be telling you whether it's good. They should be telling you what needs to be changed in the design. And that doesn't just go for disabled folks, right? That goes for technologies that women are going to use. That goes for technologies that people with darker skin tones are going to use. That goes for technologies that people who aren't wealthy and don't have the latest high-speed devices or don't have high-speed bandwidth in their homes. We need to make sure that the people who decide what technologies get created are the people who stand most to lose or gain from this, and particularly those who are most vulnerable in the community and made more vulnerable by these kinds of illusions of moral solvency. So to resolve that problem of not seeing what your technology is going to do to people, then have those people that the technology will be affecting driving the bus, right, with you. And that kind of participatory design and co-consultative design of new technologies is something that I hope we'll see more and more of in the coming years.
Thank you very much. And now the last word is for Aude.
Yes, thank you, Shannon, Sam, and Antonio for such an interesting moment, really. So the last session of this seminar will take place on June 10th in the company of Antonio again, of course, but also Lily Irani and the artist Elisa Giardina Papa. Until then, well, take good care of you, and thanks again for joining us tonight. If you missed the beginning, or if you want to see the session again, you'll find it on the Gaîté Lyrique's website, the Facebook page, and their YouTube channel. Until then, bye-bye.